Running Wolf, like many of his people, was no stranger to the ways of battle. In the spring of 1876, he enlisted in the U.S. Army at Fort Lincoln. Alongside him were 6 other Arikara scouts: Young Hawk, Horns in Front, Tall Bear, Foolish Bear, Red Foolish Bear, and Charging Bull. It wasn't long before they packed up and set out. Their first stop was at Fort Stevenson, where they spent the night. The scout party was led by Big John, an experienced Arikara scout, known for his leadership skills. After resting at Fort Stevenson, the group moved forward, stopping briefly at a spot just north of where Washburn sits today. They arrived in Bismarck by noon and crossed the river via a steamboat. The following morning, they made their way to military headquarters. There, they were enlisted and their camp was set up near the base of a hill. The soldiers, meanwhile, camped farther back, away from the river. It wasn't long before they heard word that Custer was in Washington. He was expected to return soon, and once he did, an expedition was to begin. When Custer finally returned, it took 6 days before the army began their march. On the last day before they set out, something notable happened. Bobtailed Bull, one of the scouts, was promoted to sergeant. This wasn't just a promotion, it signified the growing importance of the scout group. On the morning of the march, the scouts were told to prepare for a parade. They would march in the traditional Indian style, singing songs familiar to them, songs that were not just melodies but stories of their people. These songs would echo through the camp as the scouts led the way with Custer at the head and the white cavalry trailing behind. The scout chief, Varnum, also known as Peaked Face, traveled with the group, setting up camp near the scouts. His camp was simple, with only a cook and an orderly attending to his needs. Over the next days, the scouts and soldiers moved across the plains, their progress marked by stops for meals and rest. Each camp was numbered and named after landmarks they encountered. Camp number 3, for example, became known as Turkey Buzzard Camp, where they sent 2 scouts back with mail to inform others of their progress. As they pressed forward, the terrain grew more challenging. The weather turned, and heavy rains slowed the march. The soldiers struggled to keep the wagons on course, and in some areas, the roads became too muddy to continue without stopping. Still, the scouts pushed on, camp after camp, always looking ahead. At one point, Red Foolish Bear reported an issue. He had to leave Red Bear behind, whose horse had given out. A small party of scouts was sent to bring Red Bear back, and they rejoined the main group in the early morning hours. The army finally reached the Badlands by noon on a particular day, and it was here that Custer made an interesting choice. He went ahead to scout out a trail for the wagons. This was typical of his leadership style. He often took risks, putting himself in harm's way, a pattern that would come to define his last moments during the battle. It wasn't long before they set up camp number 10 in the rough terrain of the Badlands. From here, the soldiers worked to gather timber to help cross difficult stretches of land, cutting trees for bridges where necessary. By this point, Running Wolf and the other scouts were beginning to feel the weight of the long journey. But they carried on, knowing the importance of their role. Each scout knew that their job was more than just a military duty, it was a responsibility to their people, to the land they called home, and to the soldiers they guided. A few days into their travels, Custer sent out a small group of scouts ahead to find fresh signs of the Dakota people. 7 scouts in total were selected for this dangerous task, including Young Hawk, One Feather, and Running Wolf. They weren't to return until they had discovered something of value, anything that might tell them where the enemy had gone. Meanwhile, the army continued its march, reaching camp number 19 at the mouth of the Powder River. It was here that Running Wolf and his companions learned something troubling. The soldiers were beginning to feel the strain of the journey. With each passing day, they grew more weary, and morale seemed to dip. At some point, the scouts came to a place called Soldier Butte. This was the spot where they would receive the news of their most fateful task. Running Wolf's group, along with several soldiers, were ordered to take the dispatches, important letters that Custer needed sent to the base camp at Powder River. The scouts, though weary, accepted their orders without question. As they set out on this mission, it became clear that the situation was growing more tense by the day. The presence of the Dakota was becoming increasingly apparent. But Running Wolf and the others pushed forward, making their way across the plains through rough terrain. It wasn't long before the scouts reached a steamboat on the Bighorn River. The boat had come upriver to retrieve the wounded and survivors from Custer's ill-fated expedition. It was on this boat that Running Wolf and his companions first heard the full extent of the disaster that had befallen the U.S. Army. Survivors from Custer's group were aboard, some of them grievously wounded. Among them was Goose, one of the scouts. His hand was wrapped in a bandage, and he looked exhausted. He shared his account of the battle. They had been surrounded by the Dakota, cut off in the timber, and though they fought fiercely, they had barely escaped with their lives. When Running Wolf and the others learned that several of their fellow scouts had perished, Bloody Knife, Bobtailed Bull, and others, they were overcome with sorrow. The reality of what had happened began to settle in. The scouts had not only failed in their mission, but their own people had been wiped out in a bloody conflict that would become one of the defining moments in American history. After the initial camp, the scouts began their long journey toward the Little Bighorn. The days of travel blurred together as the army marched west, across vast stretches of land and through different weather, sometimes facing rain or mud that seemed to slow them down to a crawl. From Fort Berthold, they moved southward, their route filled with familiar faces. Custer, ever the leader, pushed ahead, often with little regard for his own safety. The scouts, led by men like Big John and Varnum, did their best to guide the way. The Arikara men were seasoned, and though they were smaller in number compared to the soldiers, they carried with them the wisdom of their ancestors and the determination to protect their people from what they saw coming. There were some light-hearted moments, like when they marched in formation, singing their songs in the Indian style, to the rhythm of their own voices. Those songs, though simple, carried the weight of generations, stories of survival, war, and their connection to the land. As much as it was a time of duty, it was also a time to remember who they were. By the time they reached the Badlands, the army had already passed through countless hardships, weathering storms, rough terrain, and even moments when the soldiers thought about turning back. But this was nothing new. For the Arikara scouts, this was just another day in a long history of walking the land. After days of trekking through some of the toughest terrain they'd ever seen, they finally reached a place where the landscape started to shift, where the land began to reveal its secrets. It was here, near the mouth of the Powder River, where the first signs of the Dakotas were found. They had come across fresh tracks, signs of a people who had been moving just ahead of them. Custer knew it was time to make his move. He needed to send scouts out to find the Dakotas, find them before they found him. And so, the order was given to send ahead a team of scouts, both Arikara and Dakota, to track down the enemy. It was a delicate mission, but one that felt familiar to the men who had walked these paths for years. Among those chosen was Running Wolf, a man who had learned to read the land like few others. With him went Young Hawk, Forked Horn, and One Feather. Their task was clear: find the Dakotas, but don't get caught. As the scouts rode out ahead of the main army, it was clear that danger was never far behind. The Dakotas were close. The feeling of being hunted was in the air. Every ridge, every valley, seemed like it could hold an enemy waiting to pounce. But the Arikara scouts knew their craft. They weren't just following tracks, they were reading them, deciphering the subtle signs left behind. They had walked with nature for as long as they could remember. Every broken twig, every bent blade of grass, spoke to them in ways that no soldier could understand. As the scouts ventured further into Dakota territory, the tension rose. They weren't just marching, they were on a hunt. By the time the scouts returned to the base camp, the whispers of the approaching Dakotas were no longer rumors. They were a reality. Custer, anxious for action, ordered his men to prepare for what was coming. The army moved again, now with a greater sense of urgency. As the scouts reported back to Custer with the information they had gathered, the mood in camp became one of grim determination. It wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for the future. The soldiers continued to push ahead, marching through rough terrain and through moments where they were unsure if the next step would lead to an ambush. Yet they pressed on. Then came the moment where Custer's impatience would cost him. At the Powder River, Custer had his scouts, including Running Wolf, carry messages back and forth between his camp and the main force. The soldiers were starting to feel the strain. Days of travel were wearing on everyone, but the pressure from their leader was unyielding. By now, it had become clear to the scouts that the Dakotas were not just a threat, they were a force to be reckoned with. Their camps were hidden along the Rosebud, deep in the timber, and the soldiers were too spread out to make any real progress. It was at this point that Running Wolf and the other scouts realized the magnitude of what was coming. The battle wasn't going to be a small skirmish. It was going to be a fight for the very soul of the plains. The Battle of the Little Bighorn would soon be upon them, and every moment of the journey had led up to this. On the day of the battle, Custer made his final, fateful decision. He split his forces, sending some to pursue the Dakotas and leaving others to protect the rear. It was a move that would soon become infamous in history, one that would leave the soldiers scattered and vulnerable. As the battle began, the scouts could see that Custer's forces were not prepared for what they faced. The Dakotas were everywhere, circling, attacking from all sides, pushing the soldiers to their limits. The Arikara scouts did what they could, but they knew that they were fighting not just for their survival, but for something larger. The soldiers, overwhelmed, outnumbered, and outmaneuvered, began to fall. It wasn't long before the cries of battle filled the air, and the scene turned chaotic. At that moment, Running Wolf and the other scouts realized something. This battle, this moment, had been written in the land itself. The Arikara were fighters, but so were the Dakotas, and on that day, the land belonged to them. The hours of fighting felt like an eternity. It was a battle where no one emerged untouched. But the scouts, who had seen death before, carried on with the same calm and grace that had been passed down to them for generations. When the dust finally settled and the survivors regrouped, Running Wolf found himself reflecting on the futility of it all. The scouts had done what they could, but the battle was a tragic reminder of the way things were changing. It wasn't just about survival, it was about watching an old world slip away, even as the new world crept closer. After the battle, the remaining scouts rode alongside the soldiers, but it was clear that the unity they once had was fractured. They had all been swept up in a conflict that had been brewing for years, and the outcome of that battle would echo through history for generations to come. The survivors made their way back to the base camp, weary and broken, carrying with them the heavy burden of loss. It wasn't just the soldiers who had paid the price. The scouts, too, had lost friends and brothers in the fight. Names like Bloody Knife, Bobtailed Bull, and Little Brave, men who had been comrades, now were gone. Their stories would live on in the hearts of those who had fought alongside them. As the survivors continued their journey back to Fort Lincoln, Running Wolf couldn't help but think of the land that had been home to so many for so long. What would become of it now? What would become of them? But those questions were left unanswered. For now, the journey continued, and all the scouts could do was ride on, knowing that the world they had known was forever changed.